Welcome to the official podcast series by POTENZA, where innovation meets insight. In this series, we dive deep into the world of SAP, explore the power of robotic process automation, and unlock the true potential of data analytics. Whether you're a tech enthusiast, a business leader, or just curious about the digital transformation shaping our world, you're in the right place. Tune in, stay curious, and let's explore the future of enterprise technology together. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on YouTube for more powerful insights. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Data is everywhere, piling up faster than we can really track it. But hidden in all that information is a question that's becoming, well, strategically vital. Who actually owns it all?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a concept that, used to feel very much like a back office compliance thing.
Right, something for the legal department.
Exactly, just something they wrestled with.
Yeah.
But the source material we've been digging into, it paints a really different picture now. It shows that understanding and managing data ownership, it's shifting fast from just a requirement to a core strategic asset.
Okay, that's quite a shift. And we've got, a whole stack of research and analysis here looking specifically at this. So I guess our mission for this deep dive is to really cut through the noise, understand what ownership data actually is, why it's suddenly a competitive advantage, and frankly, how managing it effectively needs the same discipline you'd use for owning physical property, like real estate.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It really is about getting down to the details of who has the rights and how that control is, exercised and documented, especially now with so much data and regulation flying around. For you, our listener, getting that clarity is going to be, indispensable.
Okay, so let's start right there. When we talk about ownership data, what exactly are we defining? What's the core idea?
At its heart, ownership data is basically the proof. It's the documentation showing who holds the legal rights and, importantly, the responsibilities tied to specific data sets or records.
Okay.
It's about establishing that formal claim, who has the authority to use it, change it, transfer it, and who's accountable if something goes wrong.
And this is where that real estate analogy really clicks, isn't it?
Absolutely. Think about buying a house. You need deeds, title insurance, surveys, the whole history, a paper trail, basically, to prove it's yours.
Right.
Ownership data does the same thing, but for information assets. It doesn't matter if it relates to a physical property or something purely digital. It's the documentation of possession and control.
And the sources we looked at, they give a pretty clear sense of what falls under this umbrella.
Yeah, they do. And it's broader than you might think. We're not just talking about simple customer lists. This stuff can include property title details, really complex corporate shareholding structures,
right,
historical deeds, transaction records, official registration info sitting in government databases, and even the proof for digital assets, things like intellectual property or, NFTs.
NFTs, right, those non-fungible tokens, so unique digital ownership markers.
Exactly. It covers the whole spectrum.
Okay, so it's the formal, documented history of who owns what data-wise. Why is this moving out of that, compliance corner and becoming so critical right now? What's the driver?
Well, it's really striking from the sources is just how fundamental this has become. As the global data landscape matures, and especially as regulations tighten up everywhere, things like GDPR in Europe.
The big data privacy one, yeah.
Right, or financial transparency rules. And as data ecosystems get more connected, ownership data isn't just important, it's becoming central to everything.
It sounds like ignoring this just isn't really an option anymore.
It really isn't. The sources, they highlight specific benefits. It's essential for transparency in global markets. It's a non-negotiable part of anti-money laundering compliance.
Okay, critical for finance.
Absolutely vital for securing property rights and tracing the lineage, the history of assets. And it's fundamental for big business activities like mergers and acquisitions or investor due diligence.
Right, you need to know what you're actually buying or investing in.
Precisely. And of course, it underpins everything to do with data privacy and consent. You can't manage consent if you don't know who owns the data it applies to.
So the big takeaway here is that it's moved beyond just ticking legal boxes. This is actually a strategic differentiator now.
That's exactly it. The sources strongly suggest that going forward, especially beyond 2025, getting data ownership right is a strategic lever. It's how you build trust with customers, with partners. It's how you manage risk effectively.
And unlock value.
And unlock hidden value, yeah. Across all sorts of industries, real estate, finance, healthcare, tech, knowing definitively who owns what, having it documented, keeping it secure, That's becoming the bedrock for, well, future business agility and trust.
Well, let's maybe peel back the layers on that definition a bit more. You mentioned legal rights and accountability. Is there a deeper concept the sources were exploring there?
Yes, there is. A key insight is that ownership isn't just about having the title on paper. The sources really emphasize that it's about stewardship.
Stewardship.
So
Okay.
the data owner isn't just the name listed. They're responsible for actively ensuring the documentation, the security, the overall governance for that data.
Yeah.
That it's all robustly maintained. That active management is where integrity and trust are actually built.
And the source material, it identified different ways this ownership can actually look, right? It's not all the same.
Right. Yeah, ownership isn't monolithic. It varies quite a bit based on where the data came from, how it's being used, and the regulations around it. You've got individual ownership, this personal data, where the person, the subject, keeps control.
Okay, like my health records, maybe?
Potentially, yeah. Then there's corporate ownership, where organizations hold records like customer databases or internal operational data. You also see joint ownership sometimes, where multiple parties share the rights and responsibilities.
Like a partnership project?
Could be, yeah. And a very common one now is third-party custodianship.
Mm-hmm.
Think about cloud services or SaaS platforms. One entity owns the data legally, but another company physically stores and manages it for them.
And each of those models needs its own specific set of rules for rights and protection and proof.
Precisely. The sources really stress that. The framework for managing it, protecting it, proving ownership has to be tailored to these different types. You can't use a one-size-fits-all approach.
This brings us, I think, squarely to the legal side. I mean, who owns the data must have massive legal implications.
Oh, absolutely massive. Legal frameworks are deeply influenced by data ownership. It dictates everything from how you resolve disputes to mandatory regulatory compliance.
Like GDPR or BIPA.
Exactly. So, for instance, a business might generate data that they consider their intellectual property, their IP, but they still have really strict legal obligations under privacy laws, like HIPAA for health data or CCPA in California for personal consumer data.
So even if you own the data commercially, the law might say, hold on, there are rules about what you can actually do with it.
That's exactly right. These laws define what kind of consent you need, who can access the data, how it can be processed, often quite separate from the commercial IP ownership, and legally proving your ownership claim. It all comes down to documentation.
Right.
Without contracts, licenses, verifiable records, just like needing a deed for property, trying to assert your rights in court, becomes incredibly difficult, almost impossible sometimes.
And the flip side of having rights is, well, responsibility, which usually means liability.
That's a critical point the sources underline.
Yeah.
The owner is the one who is legally liable for things like data breaches, for misuse of the data, or even just for failing to maintain the necessary ownership records and follow registration requirements. Responsibility just inescapably follows ownership.
Okay, this sounds like, frankly, way too much for one person or even one team to handle in a large organization. The sources must talk about the different roles involved here.
They do, yeah. It's definitely a multi-role effort. You typically have the data owner at the top. They have the ultimate control. They assign rights. They're accountable. Then there's the data steward.
Okay, what do they do?
Their focus is more on the data's quality, enforcing standards, making sure it's actually usable and fit for purpose. Then you have IT custodians. They manage the technical side, the infrastructure, the databases, the tools storing and accessing the data.
And legal, presumably?
And legal teams are crucial, absolutely. They monitor the contracts, ensure compliance with usage terms, handle necessary registrations, and deal with compliance for things like asset transfers.
So all these roles, they have to work together to make sure that chain of custody, the documentation, the security, it's all maintained properly and, importantly, linked back to the overall business strategy, whether that's about real estate assets or intellectual property.
Precisely. It's a collaborative operational model. It has to be, to ensure the integrity and trustworthiness of that ownership data over time.
All right, so we know the what and the why and the who. How do organizations actually move from just understanding this to, putting it into action? What do the sources suggest as best practices?
Well, a major takeaway, and it comes up repeatedly, is the call to treat data ownership documentation with the same seriousness, the same rigor you'd apply to, say, financial accounts or property deeds.
You wouldn't let your accounting records just float around undocumented.
Exactly. So you shouldn't let your ownership data either. That's the core principle. Treat data assets like physical property. First, establish crystal clear roles. Who owns which data sets? No ambiguity allowed.
Okay.
Second, document everything related to that ownership, every change in title, every transfer, who has access, make sure you have proof. Store it securely, ideally in a repository that tracks versions.
And centralize it, right? Not scattered everywhere.
Crucially, centralize those records. The sources really warn against letting ownership data fragment across different departments or systems. That leads to chaos.
I can only imagine the headache in a big company trying to pull together decades of scattered records. That must be a huge task.
It is a significant challenge, and the sources definitely acknowledge that. They also stress integrating legal oversight continuously, not just when a problem pops up, but as part of the process. Legal validation, checking contracts, protecting assets, it's ongoing work.
And audits.
And finally, yes, regular audits and access reviews. They're essential to catch inconsistencies, make sure everything's accurate, and stay compliant. There was actually one pointed finding, the POTENZA recommendation, which strongly suggests investing in platforms.
Technology again.
Yeah, platforms that can combine role-based access controls with built-in traceable documentation features, making it easier to manage.
So technology is key to handling the complexity. And policies, I assume, must be the absolute backbone of all this.
Oh, absolutely. The sources are clear. Policies are non-negotiable. Without solid written policies, you end up with shadow ownership.
Yeah.
Data where nobody's clearly accountable. And that's where breaches and disputes happen.
So what does a good policy include?
A robust policy needs to explicitly declare who owns what data asset. It needs to define the rights and restrictions on using it. Detail the protocols for granting access and handling transfers, include the necessary legal and compliance clauses, and specify exactly how documentation should be created, what format, how long it's kept, and how it's validated.
Seems comprehensive. What are the biggest roadblocks organizations usually hit when they actually try to implement all this stuff?
The sources are pretty consistent on the common hurdles. Number one is usually decentralized data silos. Information and its ownership records are just scattered everywhere in different formats, different systems.
Right.
Then there's often a fundamental lack of clarity, unclear or overlapping roles, especially when teams grow or organizational structures change. People just don't know who's responsible.
Documentation issues.
Poor documentation is rampant.
Yeah.
Incomplete or outdated history makes it impossible to verify who actually owns what right now. Keeping up with constantly changing regulatory expectations is another huge challenge.
Always moving targets.
Always. And finally, system integration gaps. Different platforms don't talk to each other, so a change in ownership or access made in one place doesn't get reflected elsewhere, creates inconsistencies.
And there was a POTENZA caution mentioned in the sources, wasn't there? About when these problems tend to surface.
Yeah, the caution was that these problems often stay hidden, festering under the surface, until a really critical moment, like during due diligence for a merger or a sudden regulatory audit, and then trying to fix them is suddenly far more costly, far more difficult, and potentially damaging.
Yeah, much harder to fix under pressure. Proactive investment really pays off here, it sounds like.
Exactly. It's a prime example of how getting clarity up front saves exponentially more down the road.
Okay, let's zoom out just a little bit. How does this specific concept of ownership data relate to broader data practices, like just general data management?
It's a really crucial relationship. Think of it like this. Ownership answers the who has the authority, the responsibility, the accountability for a specific data set. Data management answers the how.
How we handle it day to day?
Exactly. The practical processes for organizing it, storing it, securing it, maintaining it, eventually disposing of it, whether it's digital property records or customer lists or anything else.
So strong data management practices are essentially what make the ownership documentation reliable and actually accessible when you need it.
Precisely. Good management ensures the proof of ownership is accurate and usable. The sources actually offer a great POTENZA tip here. Treat every significant data asset like it's a piece of physical property.
Back to the real estate idea.
Yep. Assign it a named owner, define its management protocol, how it's handled, secured, updated, and put a schedule in place for regularly reviewing its status and its ownership. That simple framing, it forces accountability and structure.
And data governance, that feels very closely linked too.
It is. Governance is really the formal framework that makes all this work. It's the set of rules and processes that formalize the ownership structures we've been talking about.
So it defines things like
registration protocols for when new data assets are created, controls for how data can be transferred, audit trails for tracking changes, standardization rules for the data itself. Without a solid governance framework, ownership can become ambiguous really, really quickly.
Okay, that makes sense. Why is having clear ownership so vital if you're, say, working with data for analytics or maybe building AI model?
This is a major insight from the sources, especially for anyone involved in building data-driven capabilities. If you don't know definitively who owns the source data feeding your analytics or your AI,
You don't know if you can trust it.
you cannot truly validate its quality or accuracy. You're basically operating on shaky ground.
Uh-huh.
You also run a huge risk of non-compliance with privacy and usage laws because you don't understand the rights and restrictions tied to that data. Teams might accidentally misuse sensitive assets simply because the ownership rules aren't clear or documented.
So establishing ownership means doing things like tagging data sets with their origin, who owns them, assigning stewards, and enforcing access rights based on that.
Exactly. It's how you ensure your analytics are built on verifiable truth, not guesswork, and that they're compliant. It avoids costly errors, potential biases, and legal headaches down the line.
And data sharing, that's happening more and more between organizations. That must rely incredibly heavily on clear ownership and governance, too.
It's absolutely essential for safe sharing. The sources make it really clear. You can only share data safely and efficiently if its ownership and the rules governing it are transparent and agreed upon. Otherwise, you risk exposing proprietary information, you might breach contracts inadvertently, or violate regulations. Safe sharing requires embedding usage terms with the data, clearly defining transfer or licensing rights, maybe using platforms that have dynamic access controls that can expire,
Right, limiting access.
and rigorously tracking who accessed what when. It's all about controlled access based on documented ownership and predefined rules. No ambiguity.
Okay, so we've covered the, let's call it legal or registered ownership, but the sources also highlighted a different, maybe deeper layer, beneficial ownership. Can you unpack that concept for us?
Yeah, this is a particularly fascinating area the sources really dug into because it goes beyond just the name on the legal title. Beneficial ownership is about identifying the natural person, the actual human being,
You're a real person.
the real person who ultimately owns, controls, or gets the benefits from an asset or an entity. Even if the legal ownership is held by, say, a company or a trust or some nominee acting on their behalf, they're the ones with the real power or the ones enjoying the profits.
So it's about peeling back the layers of legal structures to find the actual individual pulling the strings or getting the rewards.
Precisely. Examples could be someone with significant voting power in a company, even if their shares are technically held through multiple subsidiaries. Or the individual beneficiary who truly controls assets held in a complex trust structure. Or someone exercising control through deliberately complex, layered corporate setups designed specifically to make tracing difficult. The sources explain that as often the point to obscure the true owner.
And why is identifying this beneficial owner so critical on a global scale? What's the big deal?
Well, the sources really emphasize its importance in fighting serious financial crime. We're talking money laundering, terrorist financing, fraud, the use of anonymous shell companies, tax evasion, corruption.
Okay, big stuff.
Huge stuff. And for legitimate businesses, getting this clarity provides vital assurance. Think about client onboarding, the whole Know Your Customer or KYC process. It offers crucial clarity during due diligence for transactions, increases transparency for investors, builds confidence during asset transfers. Governments and financial institutions worldwide are increasingly putting strict mandates in place requiring this beneficial ownership disclosure.
And I can imagine that getting this information, especially across different countries with totally different legal systems and reporting requirements, must be incredibly challenging.
It is a massive hurdle. The inconsistency across jurisdictions makes piecing together a complete, accurate picture very, very difficult, which is why global initiatives like the Beneficial Ownership Data Standard, or BODS, are highlighted in the sources.
BODS, what does that do?
Essentially, these standards provide a common language, consistent fields for documenting beneficial ownership information. It makes it easier to link records from different places, and it enables platforms and government registries to integrate and validate information more quickly, often using APIs.
So that standard sounds like a really key piece of the puzzle for actually making beneficial ownership tracking feasible at scale.
It brings much-needed structure and interoperability to what was previously a very fragmented, very opaque landscape.
You know, this whole deep dive, it really drives home the point that ownership data, whether it's legal title, beneficial control, digital, physical, it isn't just some administrative chore anymore.
Not at all. The sources really conclude by reinforcing that. It is a core business asset.
Okay.
And increasingly, it's a strategic advantage. In a future that's defined by digital transformation, ever more complex regulations, and the need for real-time trust, clarity around ownership is just paramount.
So getting it right, it safeguards your rights, it enhances operational trust, strengthens your position in the market, and helps you stay compliant, agile, and importantly, investor ready.
It really boils down to having absolute confidence in your assets and knowing exactly where the accountability lies for them.
So for you, our listener, here's maybe a final thought to leave you with. If this definition of ownership is becoming so much more layered, so much more complex in our digital world, what does this evolving concept mean for how we need to think about accountability and control over any kind of asset, physical or digital, in the years to come?
That's a wrap for today's episode of the POTENZA podcast series, where we decode SAP, automate with RPA, and analyze with precision. We hope you found today's conversation insightful and inspiring. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the technologies transforming tomorrow's enterprise. Got questions or ideas for a future episode? Drop them in the comments, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time. Thank you.